Amherst, Nova Scotia, 1878. A town of modest homes and hard labor, where gossip traveled faster than the trains that cut across the frozen land. Life was simple, predictable, until it wasn't. On Princess Street, a modest wooden house stood against the Atlantic winds. Weather-worn but sturdy, it belonged to the Cox family. The walls smelled of wood smoke and wool. The floors creaked under years of footsteps. It was a house that should have been unremarkable, but soon it would become the stage for one of the most terrifying mysteries in Canadian history. The Cox household was large and busy. Daniel and Olive Teed, Esther's sister, and her husband shared the home with several children. Esther herself, just 18 years old, lived there too, bright-eyed, sensitive, and carrying a shadow of sadness that made her seem older than her years. Only months earlier, Esther had suffered something unspeakable, an attempted assault that left her shaken to her core. She never fully spoke of it, but the memory lived behind her eyes. Some believed what followed was born from that trauma. Others believed something darker had attached itself to her in that moment of fear. Life in the Cox home was noisy, cramped, and filled with ordinary troubles. Children cried, laundry needed washing, the firewood stack shrank too quickly. Yet within this normality, something else began to stir. It began with small sounds, scratches along the wall at night, faint tapping against the headboard of Esther's bed. At first, she thought it was mice. She pulled the blanket tighter, closing her eyes, telling herself not to be foolish, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though something wanted her attention. It had been waiting. The house was full of life, laughter, quarrels, but its focus was on her, Esther. She was the one whose fear tasted sweetest. It lingered by her bed at night unseen, its fingers brushing the wooden frame, just enough to wake her. Tap, tap, tap. One evening, Esther confided in her sister, Jenny. Esther, nervous whisper, "At night, I hear them." Knocks on the wall, scratches on the floor, like someone's in the room. Jenny frowned, trying to soothe her. Jenny, softly, "It's only rats, Essie. You know how old this place is. Don't let your mind run away with you." But Jenny herself began to hear it too. The knocks were too loud, too deliberate, sometimes 3 sharp raps in perfect rhythm, as if answering a question unspoken. Soon everyone in the house noticed. The sounds came night after night, always around Esther. Neighbors who visited shook their heads uneasily. Neighbor to Daniel, "Best check your walls. Maybe you've got something living in there." But no pest could explain what they all began to hear, a deep pounding on the walls and floors, as if made by invisible fists. Esther's fear grew. She clutched her blanket at night, eyes wide, praying for the noises to stop. But instead, they grew bolder. One night her bed shook violently. She cried out, and the whole household rushed in. They stood frozen, staring as the wooden frame trembled beneath her, lifting slightly from the floor before settling back with a heavy thud. Gasps filled the room. Olive, terrified, whisper, "Lord, help us. What is this?" The children screamed. Daniel tried to calm them, but his own face was pale. They watched helplessly as raps echoed along the walls, answering questions no one had dared ask. Tap, tap, tap. It delighted in their fear. It would give them more. Soon they would learn that no prayer, no locked door, no denial could keep it out. From that night on, the Cox home was never the same. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every draft carried dread. Esther, trembling in her bed, whispered through tears, "Esther," softly. "Something wants me, and it won't stop." And then, one night, the knocks would no longer be content with sound. They would strike. They would leave marks on Esther's very skin. The scratching and knocks were only the beginning. Within weeks, the disturbances inside the Cox home grew darker, bolder. What had once been dismissed as rats in the walls or childish imagination now revealed itself as something far more terrifying. The family began to notice the pattern. The sounds always followed Esther wherever she went. The rapping followed, upstairs, downstairs, even in the yard. It was as though an unseen shadow clung to her, refusing to let go. One evening, as the household prepared for bed, Esther sat quietly by the fire. The room was warm, filled with a soft hiss of the hearth. For a moment, peace seemed possible. Then, bang! A sharp knock rattled the wall just behind her head. Everyone jumped. The children screamed. Daniel rushed forward, pounding the boards with his fists. Daniel, angrily, "Who's there? Show yourself." Silence. And then another knock. Louder, closer. Bang. 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 The family stared, frozen. The blows seemed to answer Daniel's fury with mocking rhythm. It had learned their fear, and now it played with it. Each knock was a wordless laugh, each bang a reminder. I am here, I am listening, and I am stronger than you think. Soon the raps gave way to more violent disturbances. Esther's bed once again shook uncontrollably at night, but this time it didn't stop when the family rushed in. The wooden frame groaned as if gripped by invisible hands, rocking her violently back and forth. Jenny tried to hold her down, but Esther's body convulsed, her eyes wide with terror. Esther, screaming, "It's here! Get it off me!" Before their horrified eyes, her pillow was yanked from under her head and hurled across the room. A blanket followed, stripped from the bed and flung against the wall with brutal force. Olive clutched her children to her chest, trembling. Olive, in a whisper, "God save us. This is no trick. This is no child's game." The attacks did not stop there. Esther began to suffer directly. At night, she would cry out, her skin burning with sudden welts and scratches. Long red marks appeared on her arms and back, drawn by unseen claws. Sometimes her flesh swelled with deep, painful bites, though no mouth had touched her. She wept in fear, showing them the marks. Esther, sobbing, "It wants me." Why me? Her family had no answer. They could only watch in horror. It savored her terror, the way her hands shook, the way her voice cracked in desperation. She was chosen, she was its stage, and it had only just begun the performance. The neighbors soon heard the commotion and came to see for themselves. Some scoffed at first, expecting tricks, but when the raps shook the walls in their presence, when Esther's chair slid violently across the floor on its own, their skepticism crumbled into terror. Neighbor, breathless, "Lord Almighty, I saw it with my own eyes." Word spread quickly through Amherst. People whispered in shops, on street corners, in church pews. The Cox home was no longer just a family's dwelling. It was the heart of a growing legend, and in the center of it all was Esther, pale and exhausted, her body covered in fresh scratches each morning. The haunting had chosen its target, and it would not let go. One night, as Esther lay trembling in her bed, the family gathered around her, praying aloud. Their voices filled the room with desperate pleas for protection, and then, as if to mock them, the knocks returned. Bang, bang, bang. The candle flame flickered wildly, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Esther screamed. Something pressed against her throat, choking her. She clawed at her neck, her eyes bulging with terror. Daniel and Jenny pulled at her, but their hands met nothing, yet something so strong it nearly crushed the life from her. Finally, as suddenly as it began, the pressure vanished. Esther gasped for air, collapsing into sobs. The family clung to one another in silence, shaken to the core. And in that silence, 3 loud raps shook the floorboards beneath them, as if the thing itself was declaring, "This is only the beginning." The Cox home no longer belonged to its family. Every night as darkness settled over Amherst, the house transformed into a theater of dread, and Esther Cox was always the centerpiece. It began with the familiar sounds, knocks and raps echoing through the walls, but they no longer confined themselves to the quiet hours. Now they came at supper, at prayer, even in the middle of conversation. Sharp cracks interrupting human voices as though mocking them. One evening, the family tried to ignore it. They sat around the table, bowls of stew steaming in front of them. The children ate nervously, eyes darting to the walls. Then a sudden bang rattled the dishes. The spoon fell from Esther's trembling hand. Esther whispering, "It's here again." Daniel rose angrily, slamming his fist on the table. "Daniel, show yourself, coward! Leave this house. The answer came instantly, 3 deafening knocks on the floorboards beneath their feet. The bowls rattled. The children screamed. Olive gathered them close, whispering frantic prayers. It had learned to respond. They demanded. It answered. They prayed. It laughed. Their fear was music, and every note thrilled it. The attacks soon escalated. Objects began to fly through the air. Dishes crashed against the walls. Chairs toppled. Once a heavy Bible lifted from its place and hurled across the room, slamming against the far wall. The message was unmistakable. No sacred object could protect them. Esther bore the worst of it. At night, her bed shook so violently that it threatened to throw her to the floor. Invisible hands pulled the covers away. Sometimes her body rose inches above the mattress, suspended in the air before crashing back down. Jenny, her sister, tried to comfort her, but her own face was pale with terror. Jenny desperately, "Hold on, Essie, hold on." Esther's screams filled the house. Long red scratches appeared on her arms and legs as if carved by claws. Her skin burned with fresh welts each morning, though no human hand had touched her. One night, the terror became nearly unbearable. Esther sat bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with panic. Esther, gasping, "It's choking me." Her hands clawed at her throat. The family rushed in horrified as they saw the skin around her neck redden as though gripped by unseen fingers. Her breath rasped in short, broken cries. Daniel tried to pull at whatever force held her, but his hands grasped only air. Finally, as suddenly as it began, the pressure lifted. Esther collapsed back, coughing and sobbing, clutching her throat. The family stood frozen, tears streaming, helpless in the face of something they could not see, could not fight. It delighted in her suffering, the way her breath rattled, the way her family wept. It had power here, absolute power, and it was only growing stronger. Word spread quickly through Amherst. Neighbors, curious and skeptical, began to gather at the Cox home, demanding to see the strange events for themselves, and they saw. Visitors stood in the parlor, their eyes wide as knocks, sounded in direct response to their questions. Neighbor, tentatively, "How many spirits are here?" 3 loud raps shook the floor. Neighbor, voice trembling, "Are you evil?" A pause, then a violent slam against the wall, hard enough to crack the plaster. The neighbor staggered back, pale and trembling. Soon the crowds grew too large. People whispered in shops and church pews. Was Esther cursed, possessed, or was she the victim of a cruel hoax? The town was divided, but one thing was undeniable. Something beyond explanation was tormenting the girl. The entity grew bolder in front of witnesses. One night, before a room full of neighbors, Esther shrieked as her pillow burst apart, feathers exploding into the air as if ripped open by invisible claws. Gasps filled the room. Someone fainted. Another fled. Witness stammering, I saw it with my own eyes. The Cox home was no longer just a place of private fear. It was now the site of a public spectacle, And yet, the attacks on Esther grew more personal. The unseen force no longer confined itself to scratches or choking. Fires began to erupt in the house, sudden, unnatural blazes starting near Esther. Curtains burst into flame, bedding smoldered. Once, even the very floorboards beneath her bed caught fire. The family scrambled with water buckets, stamping out the flames. But the message was clear. If it wanted her dead, nothing could stop it. And soon the entity would no longer hide in shadows or silence. It would speak, and its voice would echo through Amherst like a curse. By the spring of 1879, the Cox family was no longer alone in their terror. Amherst itself had become infected with whispers of what was happening inside the house on Princess Street. The knocks, the scratches, the violent attacks on Esther, they were no longer private suffering. They had become public performance. At first, neighbors came reluctantly, out of pity, curiosity, or the quiet thrill of seeing what could not be explained. They gathered in small groups in the parlor, sitting stiffly on wooden chairs, their eyes darting toward the walls. And then the sounds began. Bang, bang, bang. Gasps filled the room. Men who had come smirking, ready to debunk the stories, paled as the walls shook around them. Neighbor, shaken. Good Lord, it's true. Some demanded proof. They began asking questions aloud, challenging the unseen, and to their horror, the knocks answered. Villager, hesitant, if you can hear us, knock once. Bang, villager, voice trembling, are you good? Silence. Villager, after pause, are you evil? Bang, bang, bang. So violent the floorboards rattled underfoot. Women screamed, men shouted for calm, but there was no calm left in Amherst. It relished the attention. Fear fed it, but belief made it stronger. Each gasp, each whispered prayer was fuel. They came to see Esther, but they would leave speaking of it. Soon, the house was crowded nightly. Dozens of witnesses pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the invisible show to begin. Chairs scraped across the floor on their own. Dishes flew from shelves. Once, a heavy trunk slid across the room with a shriek of wood against wood, scattering the crowd in panic. The entity mocked them with tricks, tossing objects in front of their eyes, and when skeptics scoffed, it responded with terrifying precision. Skeptic, mocking, if you are real, strike near me now. A loose board shot from the wall, narrowly missing his head. He fled, never to return. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Newspaper reporters traveled to Amherst. Clergymen debated the haunting in sermons. The Cox home became infamous, a place where the line between the living and the dead had grown thin. Esther herself became the unwilling focus of all this attention. Pale and exhausted, she sat trembling in her chair while strangers stared, waiting for the next eruption. Her life was no longer her own. She was a stage, a vessel, and the audience demanded more. Esther, whispering to Jenny, "Why won't it leave me alone? Why me?" Jenny could only hold her hand, her own eyes brimming with fear. It answered her silently, "Because you are mine." The town of Amherst was divided. Some swore the events were genuine, a haunting of biblical scale. Others muttered of trickery, hysteria, or madness, but even the skeptics could not explain what they saw with their own eyes. The bed lifting from the floor, the knocks answering questions, the scratches appearing on Esther's skin, the sudden fires erupting without cause. The more people doubted, the more violently it acted. One night, before a room full of townspeople, Esther screamed as a chair beneath her suddenly jerked sideways, slamming into the wall. She was thrown to the floor, writhing while raps thundered across the walls like cannon fire. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some fled into the night, others fell to their knees in prayer. The Cox home was now no ordinary dwelling. It was the epicenter of a living nightmare. But the haunting was not content with raps and tricks. It wanted more. And soon the unseen force would bear its cruelty fully, scratching, biting, and burning Esther's flesh, leaving marks no human hand could make. By summer of 1879, the Cox household no longer feared mere knocks and raps. They feared something far worse. An unseen enemy that had made Esther its prey. The townsfolk who crowded into the house each night had grown used to the raps, the shaking furniture, the flying objects, but now they began to witness something far more terrifying, the physical torment of Esther Cox herself. It began with scratches. Long red welts appeared across her arms and back in the middle of the night, as though gouged by invisible claws. She screamed in agony, writhing as Jenny and Olive tried helplessly to soothe her. Esther, sobbing, "It's cutting me. Please, make it stop." But there was nothing to fight, no hand to pull away, only the marks that swelled and bled across her skin. Her pain was its language. Every scratch, every bite, every burn was a sentence in the story it was writing on her body, and the story had no happy ending. Soon bites followed. Angry purple bruises bloomed on her arms, her shoulders, even her face. The shapes were unmistakable, teeth marks indented deep into her flesh. Though no mouth had touched her, the family showed them to the neighbors. Horrified, neighbor whispering, "This is not the work of any human." But the worst came with fire. One quiet afternoon, Esther sat trembling on the bed while Jenny read aloud from a Bible. Suddenly, the mattress beneath her began to smoke. Sparks hissed up from the fabric. Jenny screamed as flames leapt to life. Jenny panicked. "Water! Quickly!" The family scrambled, dousing the bed before it spread, the smell of burnt cloth choking the room. Esther sobbed, clutching her arms, but the fires kept coming, curtains ignited without cause. A bundle of cloth in the corner burst into flames. Even Esther's clothing smoldered at times, forcing her to tear at the fabric in terror. It loved the fire most of all. Fire was final. Fire consumed, and it whispered through the flames, promising Esther that one day it would let them burn unchecked. Doctors were called, desperate to explain what was happening. One physician, Dr. Carrot, came skeptical, expecting to uncover a trick. But as he examined Esther, the mattress beneath her burst into flames. He stumbled back, eyes wide, his professional calm shattered. Dr. Carrot, horrified, I can't explain this. It defies nature itself. He fled the house, pale, shaken, his skepticism left in ashes. Esther's body grew weaker with each attack. She lost weight, her face hollowed, dark circles ringed her eyes. She was barely 18, yet she looked years older, consumed by exhaustion and fear. The neighbors began to whisper that Esther was cursed, that she had brought the evil upon herself. Others insisted she was innocent, a victim chosen at random, but all agreed on one thing: no one could endure what she had. One evening, in front of a room of witnesses, Esther convulsed in agony. Her hands clawed at her chest as if something were crushing her lungs. Red letters appeared across her skin, swelling like welts. The crowd gasped as they read, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." A woman fainted. Others fell to their knees, crying out for mercy. Esther collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably as the words slowly faded from her body. It had made its claim. She belonged to it, and soon it would prove those words true. The family no longer wondered if Esther would survive the haunting. They wondered when the entity would finally take her life. Every moment felt like waiting for an execution. And Amherst itself was transfixed. The girl had become both victim and spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the house nightly, hoping to glimpse the supernatural through the windows. Some prayed for her, others whispered that she was possessed, that death was the only release. Inside the house, Esther trembled in her bed, clutching her crucifix, whispering through tears, "Esther, desperate, please don't let me die." But the unseen enemy had no intention of letting her die quickly. It would break her first, body, mind, and soul, until she begged for death as mercy. By midsummer, the Cox home was no longer a dwelling. It was a battlefield. Every night the family braced themselves, knowing the darkness would bring new horrors. The entity was no longer subtle. It did not knock or scratch in whispers. It roared, slammed, crashed, and burned. The house itself seemed to turn against them. It began with the windows. Glass panes shattered without warning, exploding inward as though struck by invisible stones. Shards rained across the floor, cutting hands and feet. The children wailed. Olive pulled them close, and Daniel cursed as he nailed boards over the broken frames. But the boards shook violently in their hands, rattling like teeth in a dying jaw. Olive, trembling. Even the walls won't hold it back. Then came the furniture. Tables toppled, chairs skidded across the room with terrifying force. A sewing machine, heavy and solid, lifted several inches from the floor and crashed down with a scream of metal against wood. Visitors saw it with their own eyes and fled screaming into the night. Witness panting outside the door. No human hand moved that thing. God help us, no human hand. It reveled in its strength. No longer did it need to hide. The house was its stage, and every slam, every fire, every scream was applause. The fires grew more frequent. Small blazes erupted in corners and drawers, even under the beds. Water buckets were kept constantly at hand, but the smoke choked their lungs, filled their eyes with tears. One night, flames licked the curtains in Esther's room. Daniel and Olive smothered them frantically while Esther screamed, clawing at her arms as if unseen hands were holding her in the blaze. Esther, crying, "It wants to burn me alive." The message was unmistakable. The entity no longer confined itself to the nights. Even in broad daylight, its attacks shook the household. The children cried constantly, terrified of every sound. Neighbors avoided the house, refusing to set foot inside. The Cox family grew thin, sleepless, desperate. Meals were left unfinished as dishes flew from the table. At night, they huddled together in one room, praying aloud, their voices trembling. Jenny pleading, "Please, Essie, hold on. We'll find a way to end this. We have to." Esther shook her head weakly, her eyes hollow. "Esther, softly, it won't let me go. I can feel it inside me, around me. I am never alone." She was right. It was always there, at her side, in her breath, in her blood. She was its vessel, its canvas, and it was not finished painting. By now, the haunting was no longer just Esther's curse. It infected the entire house. Doors slammed on their own. Voices muttered in empty rooms. Strange shadows passed across the walls, flickering just beyond the reach of candlelight. Visitors described the air inside the house as heavy, suffocating, like breathing smoke, even when there was no fire. Visitor, nervously, "The moment you step through that door, you feel it. Something alive in the air, watching you." The family's faith began to crack. Daniel, once defiant, now sat in silence by the hearth, his face buried in his hands. Olive prayed endlessly, her lips moving even as she slept in short, restless bursts. Jenny never left Esther's side, though her own body shook with exhaustion. And Esther drifted between terror and despair. Her nights were filled with choking, scratching, burning, her days with weakness and sobbing fits. She was barely clinging to life. One night, she whispered to Jenny in the dark, "Esther, weak, broken, I can't bear it anymore. Maybe it's better if I die, then it will end." Jenny gripped her tightly, tears spilling onto Esther's hair. Jenny, desperate, "No, don't you say that, Essie. You'll live. You must live. We'll find someone who can help." And then, as if mocking Jenny's plea, a booming voice shook the room. Disembodied voice, deep, echoing, "I am here." The walls rattled, the bed shook, Esther screamed and clutched her crucifix, her body convulsing in terror. The voice reverberated through the entire house, deep and unnatural, impossible for any human throat to produce. Everyone heard it. Everyone froze. For the first time, the entity had spoken aloud, and that voice would soon draw others to the house, not just neighbors and gawkers, but investigators, determined to prove once and for all whether the great Amherst mystery was real or something darker than anyone could imagine. By the time autumn came to Amherst, the Cox family was barely surviving. Their house was in shambles, windows broken, furniture scarred, walls cracked with blows from invisible fists, and Esther herself was a ghost of the girl she had once been, thin, hollow-eyed, trembling. But word of her suffering had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Newspaper articles carried the story across Nova Scotia. Some dismissed it as hysteria, others called it proof of the devil's hand, and soon outsiders arrived at the Cox home, curious, skeptical, and determined to uncover the truth. Among them was Walter Hubble, a traveling actor turned aspiring writer. Hubble was no priest or scientist. He was a showman, a man fascinated by the unexplained, eager to record what others dismissed. When he stepped into the Cox home for the first time, he felt it instantly. The air was heavy, charged, like the seconds before a thunderstorm. Esther sat pale in a chair, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Hubble, gently. Don't be afraid, Miss Esther. I only wish to see for myself. That is all. Esther nodded faintly, though her eyes betrayed a terror that words could not. That night, Hubble got what he came for. As the family and several witnesses gathered in the parlor, knocks began to echo from the walls. 3 sharp raps answered each question Hubble posed. Hubble, calmly, "Is there someone here with us?" Bang. Hubble, "Are you good?" Silence. Hubble, "Are you evil?" Bang, bang, bang. The room shook. A lamp toppled, its glass shattering across the floor. People screamed. Hubble's hands trembled, but his eyes gleamed. He had his proof. It liked this one, the man who wrote things down. Fear in ink lasted longer, words carried further, and with every new witness, its power grew. Over the following days, Hubble witnessed more than he could have imagined. He saw Esther thrown from her bed by invisible hands. He saw objects hurled across rooms with lethal force. He saw fires ignite out of nothing. And perhaps most chilling of all, he heard a voice late one night as Esther wept in exhaustion. A guttural growl filled the room, disembodied voice. "Leave her. She is mine." The words froze everyone. Hubble felt his blood run cold. He would later write that no living man could have produced such a sound. Esther herself was near breaking. "Esther," to Hubble weakly, "you've seen it now. Do you believe me? It wants to kill me. Every night it tries." Hubble placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. Hubble, solemnly, "Yes, Esther, I believe you, and the world will believe too." But belief was not protection. The more people came, the more violent the haunting became. In front of Hubble and a crowd of witnesses, a heavy carving knife lifted from the table and shot across the room, embedding itself in the wall inches from Esther's head. She screamed, collapsing into Jenny's arms. The room erupted in chaos, but Hubble stood pale and silent, staring at the quivering knife. He knew then this was no fraud. This was something unearthly. It laughed in silence. The knife had missed this time. It wanted them to know it could kill, that it chose not to. For now, Hubble began documenting everything, filling pages with detailed notes of each event. His presence brought a strange kind of validation. What the Cox family had endured in private was now a case, a story, a legend in the making. But it also brought more eyes, more voices, more fear, and the entity thrived on it all. By winter, Hubble's book of notes was thick, and Esther's torment was greater than ever. The scratches deepened, the bites grew harsher, the fires came suddenly, forcing the family to keep buckets at every door. The town was consumed with speculation. Was Esther a victim or a fraud? Was the haunting real or the work of her own desperate mind? The questions didn't matter to Esther. To her, there was only survival. One night, Hubble sat awake, watching over her as she tried to sleep. Her breathing steadied. The house was quiet, and then the bed rose. Hubble leapt to his feet as Esther floated inches above the mattress, her hair spilling across the pillow like water. Her eyes snapped open, glowing with terror. Esther, screaming, "Help me!" The bed slammed back down with a crack. Hubble staggered back, his hands shaking. Hubble whispering to himself, This will change everything." But if Esther thought the presence had shown its worst, she was wrong, for soon it would begin to speak more clearly, claiming names, motives, and a deadly promise that it would kill her. The knocks, the scratches, the fires, these had been terrifying enough. But by winter of 1879, the Cox family faced something far more chilling. The unseen presence had found its voice. It began with the raps. They no longer answered only yes or no questions. They spelled out words, slowly, deliberately, each knock forming letters on the alphabet board the family laid on the table. At first, the messages were simple. Hubble pointing, "What is your name?" R-A-P-R-A-P-R-A-P. The letters spelled Bob Nickel. A murmur ran through the room. Some recognized the name, a man who had once lived in Amherst, dead now for years. Jenny whispering, "But he's gone. He's been gone for so long." The knocks came again, louder. Message, "I am here. Other names followed. Sometimes it claimed to be multiple spirits. Sometimes it claimed to be demons. Its words shifted, contradictory, designed to confuse and terrify. But one message never changed. Message: Esther Cox must die. It savored the way their faces paled, the way Esther shook. Names were masks, lies were toys. It did not need truth, it needed fear, and fear was always truth enough. Esther's torment grew unbearable. In front of witnesses, welts formed across her arms and legs as she screamed. The raps spelled taunts on the walls. Message: you cannot save her. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered, hoping to see proof for themselves. They asked questions boldly, half in disbelief. Neighbor, if you are truly here, prove it. What do you want? The room shook with knocks so violent the floorboards splintered. The answer came in furious rhythm. Message: kill Esther. The neighbors fled, some crying, some swearing never to return, and still the spirit or spirits continued to speak. They described how Esther would die. They promised to burn her alive. They vowed to choke her breath from her lungs. One night, as Esther lay trembling in bed, words appeared scratched into the plaster above her head, letters gouged deep into the wall by unseen claws. Esther Cox, you are mine. She fainted from terror. She belonged to it. Every scream, every tear was proof. And when the time was right, her final breath would belong to it too. Even Hubble, who had come determined to record with calm detachment, felt the weight of the words. He confessed in his notes that he no longer believed he was watching mere phenomena. He was watching a hunt. And Esther was the prey. Her health continued to decline. She slept little, ate less, her body racked with bruises and burns. She clutched her crucifix constantly, but even in prayer, the knocks mocked her. Esther, crying to Jenny, why won't it leave me? Why won't God save me? Jenny could only hold her, her own lips trembling with silent prayers. The town was divided more than ever. Some insisted Esther was possessed. Others swore she was the victim of a hoax or madness. But those who had stood in the room, those who had seen the words spelled, heard the knocks, smelled the sudden smoke, they left convinced of one thing. Something spoke through her, and it wanted her dead. One night, as Hubble sat writing by candlelight, Esther stirred in her bed. Her eyes flew open, and a deep guttural voice spilled from her throat. Low, harsh, not her own voice. Through Esther. She is mine. She cannot escape me. The candle blew out. The room plunged into darkness. Hubble froze, his pen falling from his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He would later write that in that moment he believed he had truly heard the devil speak. And if Esther had hoped leaving Amherst would free her from the terror, she was wrong, for the curse would follow her wherever she went.